The stadium lights at MetLife flickered, a sharp, rhythmic pulse of electricity that died and surged again, casting long, erratic shadows across the empty pitch. High above the field, the massive structure groaned under the weight of the cooling metal. Down in the command center, the air was recycled and thin. A CIA analyst sat motionless, eyes locked on a bank of monitors displaying the opening ceremony rehearsal. On screen, dancers moved in perfect synchronization, their silhouettes sharp against the artificial glow. Outside the concrete walls, the world was already vibrating with the anticipation of football. Fans were gathering, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was a focal point. The analyst adjusted a dial, zooming in on the stadium staff moving through the tunnels. Every face was a data point. Every movement was a potential variable. The power flickered once more, a stuttering heartbeat in the dark. The analyst did not look away. The rehearsal continued, a bright and hollow spectacle. The stadium was no longer a place of sport. It was a stage for a collision that had been months in the making. The countdown had begun. A single line of red text pulsed across the analyst's secondary monitor. The Pentagon had updated the status. The threat level was now black. The shift was instantaneous, stripping away the clinical detachment of the previous hour. In the command center, the hum of cooling fans seemed to sharpen. The analyst tapped a command, pulling up the live feed of the opening ceremony rehearsal. The dancers on the field were no longer performers in a spectacle. They were potential collateral in a calculated strike. Every movement on the screen was now analyzed through the lens of a mass casualty event. The memo, marked "Eyes Only," scrolled across the terminal, detailing the specific window of vulnerability during the opening anthem. The analyst leaned forward, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and initiated a secure uplink to the regional task force. The stadium was no longer a venue for a game. It was a primary target. The intelligence was absolute, leaving no room for error or delay. The rehearsal continued, oblivious to the change in status. While the command center shifted into a state of total operational lockdown, every second of the ceremony was now a countdown. The threat was active. The analyst pulled the personnel manifest for the stadium staff. Names, identification numbers, and security clearances scrolled across the screen in a blur of white text. He cross-referenced the list against the latest intelligence dump from the regional field office. A red flag appeared next to a maintenance technician, then another by a catering supervisor. The pattern was unmistakable. These were not random hires. They were assets, activated months ago, placed strategically throughout the infrastructure. The analyst zoomed in on the digital profile of a lead electrician. The file contained a hidden history of tactical training and specialized communication protocols. He checked the floor plan, mapping the locations of these individuals. They were positioned at key access points, near the power conduits and the main structural supports. The analyst leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes. He was looking at a ghost army, hidden in plain sight. They were not hooligans or protesters, they were disciplined units, waiting for a single command to transition from staff to combatants. He highlighted the cluster of names, each one a node in a lethal network embedded within the stadium walls. The reality was cold and precise. The analyst bypassed the standard security protocols to access the eyes-only file. The document was brief, cold, and devastating. It outlined a simulation of the opening anthem, projecting the exact moment the sleeper cells would initiate their strike. The numbers on the screen were not just statistics. They were a calculated death toll. If the protocol was triggered during the first verse, the crush in the lower bowl would be absolute. The analyst scrolled through the casualty projections, his fingers trembling slightly as he hit the print command. The printer hummed, spitting out pages that detailed the structural vulnerabilities of the stadium exits. He highlighted the section on the anthem, where the sound levels would mask the initial chaos. The panic in the command center shifted from professional concern to a frantic, suffocating dread. He cross-referenced the simulation with the current crowd density data. The margin for error had vanished. Every second of that anthem was now a potential catastrophe. He grabbed the phone, his voice tight, demanding an immediate escalation to the Joint Chiefs. The memo was no longer a theory. It was a roadmap for a massacre. He stared at the final page, where the estimated survival rate dropped to near zero. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rapid clicking of keys as he prepared the emergency briefing. Across the Atlantic, the MI6 command center erupted into a hive of activity. The intelligence stream from the stadium had triggered a secondary alert, one that bypassed the standard threat protocols. Analysts scrambled, pulling satellite feeds and encrypted communications from the England squad's training base. They were looking for a pattern, and they found it. The surveillance was not random. It was surgical. A series of encrypted pings tracked a single, consistent path through the training grounds. The lead officer slammed his hand onto the console, silencing the room. The plot was not just about the stadium. It was about the player. He pointed to the screen, where a digital map showed the convergence of multiple unknown assets. They were not preparing for a mass casualty event. They were positioning for an extraction. The MI6 teams moved with lethal efficiency, abandoning their desks. They had minutes to secure the perimeter before the target was compromised. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of the discovery. The agents checked their weapons, their faces set in grim lines. They were hunting a shadow team that had already breached the outer defenses. The race had begun. The target was Jude Bellingham. The name flashed on every monitor in the MI6 war room, accompanied by a dossier of his training schedule and security detail. He was no longer just a player on the pitch. He was the center of a state-sponsored abduction plot. The intelligence was chillingly specific. The extraction teams were already in position, waiting for the stadium lights to flicker during the anthem. They intended to use the ensuing panic as a smokescreen to snatch him from the England base. The lead analyst pulled up the projected flight path of a blacked-out transport helicopter, its route cutting through the restricted airspace above the stadium. This was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated move to turn a global sports icon into a geopolitical pawn. If they succeeded, the leverage would be absolute. The MI6 commander stared at the screen, watching the digital icon of the player move in real time. Every movement on the training field was being tracked by predators who had already bypassed the outer perimeter. The weight of the situation hit the room like a physical blow. The player was unaware, still practicing his footwork while the trap tightened around him. The agents adjusted their tactical gear, their focus narrowing to a single objective. The request for satellite coverage over the Kansas City training base went unanswered for the third time. In the MI6 command center, the silence from the CIA was deafening. The American agency had locked their data streams, citing jurisdictional protocols that effectively blinded their British counterparts. The MI6 lead officer slammed his terminal shut, his jaw tight. He knew the game. The CIA was protecting their own intelligence assets, even if it meant leaving the England squad vulnerable to the unfolding threat. The friction in the room was palpable, a sharp contrast to the cold, clinical efficiency of the mission. Every second wasted on diplomatic wrangling was a second the extraction team gained. The commander stood, his decision made. He bypassed the secure channel and initiated a direct uplink to the field teams. If the Americans would not share the satellite data, the British would secure the ground themselves. He authorized the immediate deployment of tactical units onto American soil, a move that defied every standard protocol of international intelligence cooperation. The agents moved to the transport bay, their gear clattering against the metal floor. The transport touched down in the heartland, but the MI6 tactical team found no fortress waiting for them. They stepped out into a landscape that defied every defensive doctrine they had ever practiced. Kansas City was a sprawling grid of open roads, flat horizons, and endless access points that stretched for thousands of miles. The lead operative scanned the perimeter, his eyes tracing the line where the asphalt met the horizon. There was no way to lock this down. A secure perimeter required natural barriers or controlled entry points, but here, the land was a sieve. The team fanned out, setting up sensors along the fence line, but the data feed was a nightmare of noise. The commander stood in the center of the training pitch, watching the England squad move through their drills, fully exposed. The mission had shifted from a surgical operation to a desperate, impossible watch over a landscape that refused to be contained. The ground-level failure was only the beginning. As the tactical team struggled to seal the perimeter, the radar arrays at the command post began to pulse with erratic, high-frequency anomalies. The lead analyst leaned into his monitor, his fingers hovering over the kill switch for the anti-air batteries. He expected a single bogey, a drone, or a stray aircraft. Instead, The screen bloomed with hundreds of tiny synchronized signatures. It was a swarm. These were not military-grade assets that could be tracked or jammed. They were low-cost, mass-produced units, swarming like locusts. The commander watched the feed as the swarm maneuvered with a fluid, unnatural intelligence. He ordered the anti-air systems to lock on, but the technology was built for speed and altitude, not for a cloud of thousands of micro-targets. The missiles were useless. The sensors were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of targets, creating a static-filled mess of data that rendered the defense grid blind. The swarm moved closer, a dark, buzzing shadow descending toward the pitch. The threat did not just come from the sky. It was already buried in the concrete beneath their feet. While the tactical team stared at the horizon, a senior cyber analyst at the Pentagon saw the grid's pulse stutter. He pulled up the regional power schematics, his cursor trembling as he navigated the encrypted layers of the city's electrical backbone. There, hidden in the subroutines of the main substation, was a logic bomb. It was a digital fuse, silent and waiting. He tried to isolate the code, but the bomb was designed to self-replicate, burying itself deeper into the infrastructure. The analyst watched the kill switch timer count down in milliseconds. If this triggered, the stadium lights would die instantly. 80,000 people, packed into the tiered stands, would be plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. He hit the emergency override, but the system locked him out. The stadium was still bright, but the structure was now a tomb. The digital threat was not limited to the power grid. While the command center fought the logic bomb, a new, more chaotic signal surged across the dark web. Propaganda channels, dormant for months, suddenly flared to life. They were no longer broadcasting general threats. They were issuing specific, localized calls for lone wolf strikes. The intelligence feed filled with thousands of encrypted messages, each one a direct instruction to individuals already inside the stadium perimeter. These were not organized tactical units that could be tracked or intercepted. They were independent actors, blending perfectly into the sea of fans. The security teams scrambled to update their facial recognition databases, but the software returned nothing but false positives. Every face in the stands became a potential variable. The analysts watched the crowd density map shift as the propaganda calls gained traction. People moved in ways that defied the standard flow of stadium traffic. The threat was no longer a single point of failure. It was distributed. Every spectator, every vendor, and every staff member was now a potential trigger. The sheer scale of the potential violence paralyzed the command center. They were staring at 80,000 people, knowing the fuse had already been lit. As June 11th drew closer, the abstract threat of data and signals solidified into a crushing physical weight. Inside the command center, the air grew stale, thick with the smell of ozone and cold coffee. Security teams on the ground were no longer just watching screens. They were hunting shadows in real time. Every team leader felt the strain in their shoulders, a constant, low-level vibration of adrenaline that refused to dissipate. They moved through the concourses, their eyes scanning the faces of the crowd, looking for the one tremor in a hand or the one glance that lingered too long. But the stadium was a sea of humanity, and the sheer scale of it began to break them. A field unit tried to intercept a suspicious individual near the north gate, but the crowd surged, swallowing the target before the team could close the distance. They were forced to pull back, their movements hampered by the very people they were trying to protect. The England squad emerged from the tunnel and onto the pristine turf of MetLife. The stadium was largely empty, save for the hum of maintenance crews and the distant, rhythmic thud of a ball against a net. Jude Bellingham led the warm-up, his movements fluid and precise, entirely focused on the mechanics of the game. He had no idea that his every stride was being dissected by two distinct sets of eyes. From the high-altitude vantage points, MI6 tactical teams tracked his position. Through thermal optics, their fingers hovering over triggers, ready to extract him at the first sign of a breach. Simultaneously, embedded sleeper cells watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, their hands resting on concealed devices, waiting for the signal to turn the pitch into a kill zone. Bellingham stopped to tie his laces, his head tilted toward the upper tiers. He scanned the empty seats, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, but found only the cold, unblinking lenses of security cameras. He stood, wiped sweat from his brow, and rejoined the drill. He was a professional athlete preparing for a final, Yet he was also the primary pawn in a geopolitical endgame. The predators adjusted their positions in the dark, closing the gap, while the protectors tightened their perimeter, creating a suffocating web of surveillance around the grass. The players continued their practice, oblivious to the fact that they were performing in the middle of a silent, lethal standoff. The command center screens flickered with a relentless stream of faces. Thousands of spectators poured through the turnstiles, a chaotic river of movement that defied simple categorization. Analysts leaned into their monitors, eyes bloodshot, as the facial recognition software struggled to process the density of the crowd. Every blink, every turn of a head, triggered a cascade of false positives. The system pinged incessantly, flagging innocent fans as potential threats, drowning the operators in a sea of useless data. A lead analyst slammed a hand against the console when the feed lagged, the delay turning the live footage into a stuttering, fragmented mess. They were looking for tactical units, for individuals with the cold, calculated stillness of trained operatives. But the sheer volume of humanity acted as a perfect shroud. The units were already inside, moving through the concourses with the same casual rhythm as the families and sports fans surrounding them. Every camera angle revealed only more noise, more variables, and more uncertainty. The security teams in the field reported back, their voices tight with frustration, confirming that the perimeter was porous. The realization settled over the room like a suffocating fog. The enemy was not approaching the gates. They were already standing in the stands, waiting for the final countdown to begin. The stadium air grew heavy, thick with the anticipation of 80,000 souls. Outside, the world waited for the kickoff whistle, a sound that would signal the start of the final. Inside the structure, the atmosphere was different. The sleeper cells, scattered throughout the tiers, stopped their pretense of cheering. A single encrypted pulse hit their devices, a silent command that bypassed the noise of the crowd. The shift was subtle but absolute. Hands that had been holding plastic cups or waving flags now moved with purpose, reaching for concealed triggers, hidden beneath the seats. They were no longer spectators. They were weapons in a state of suspended animation. Across the command center, the monitors showed a sudden, synchronized stillness in the stands. The analysts watched, their breath hitching as they identified the anomaly. It was not a movement, but a lack of one. A pocket of individuals had stopped reacting to the game entirely, their focus fixed on the pitch where the players prepared. For the start, the signal had been received. The countdown to the final was no longer a matter of minutes, but of seconds. The whistle was coming. The command center screens turned a violent, pulsing red. The logic bomb had triggered. Deep within the regional power grid, lines of malicious code began to overwrite the stadium's control protocols. Lights flickered, dimmed, and surged, casting long, erratic shadows across the pitch. Analysts scrambled, fingers flying over keyboards in a desperate attempt to isolate the corrupted nodes. One server rack sparked, the smell of ozone filling the air as the system began to dump its cooling fluid. They had seconds to kill the connection before the stadium went dark. Then, the secondary alerts screamed. A swarm of drones had cleared the horizon, moving at high velocity toward the open roof. The operators were caught in a vice. If they focused on the grid, the drones would reach the pitch unopposed. The lights stabilized, but the drone swarm was already descending. The race to intercept had shifted from the digital realm to the physical skies. The drone swarm descended like a cloud of steel hornets, their rotors humming a low, lethal vibration that cut through the stadium roar. In the command center, the anti-air array jammed. The manual override failed to lock onto the targets. The lead analyst slammed a fist against the console, watching the swarm tighten its formation above the pitch. This was no longer about the trophy resting on the podium. It was about the survival of the stadium itself. The intelligence reports had been right, but the scale of the threat had been underestimated. The era of international sports as a sanctuary was burning away in real time. Every second that ticked by on the stadium clock felt like a decade of history collapsing. The protectors on the ground moved toward the pitch, but they were too late to intercept the descent. The crowd remained oblivious, a sea of motion, while the command center staff watched the final countdown to impact. The logic bomb had been the distraction. The drones were the execution, and the stadium was the tomb. As the referee raised the whistle to his lips, the air in the command center turned cold. The whistle blew, and the sky fell. The whistle sounded, sharp and thin against the roar of 80,000 voices. On the pitch, the ball moved, a blur of motion that signaled the start of the final. In the stands, the wave of sound rose, a deafening tide that drowned out the mechanical hum of the descending swarm. The command center staff sat frozen, their eyes locked on the tactical display. The drones were no longer just data points. They were shadows closing in on the green expanse. Every player on the field was a target, yet they moved with the rhythm of the game, oblivious to the steel rain gathering above the roof. The lead analyst reached for the emergency broadcast switch, his hand hovering over the red toggle. To trigger it was to incite a stampede. To leave it was to invite total destruction. He pulled his hand back, watching the screen. The ball crossed the midfield line. The swarm reached the apex of its descent. Silence reigned in the command center, a vacuum of sound that stood in stark contrast to the thunder outside. The world held its breath, suspended in the single, agonizing second before the collision. The game was underway, but the war had already been lost in the quiet, dark corners of the facility. The stadium lights glowed, indifferent to the fate hanging by a thread above the grass. The ball rolled across the center circle. The crowd roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that masked the mechanical death hovering above the roof. In the command center, the screens flickered one last time before locking onto the target. The lead analyst let his hand drop from the console. There was no broadcast to send, no alarm to trigger, no way to stop the descent. The tactical units in the stands stood ready, their eyes fixed not on the pitch, but on the exits. The stadium lights hummed, casting long, distorted shadows over the grass. The players moved in a dance of precision, unaware that the game had already ended in the digital dark. Every heartbeat in the arena was a ticking clock. The swarm dipped, a black cloud against the bright stadium glare. The world watched the match, but the match was a ghost. In the final, frozen second, the silence of the command center became the silence of the world. The thread snapped. The shadow descended. The screen went black.